All right, guys, so this is going to be one in a series of videos that we're going to use up until I come back to school at some point next week. So I'm going to finish up Unit 1 with you probably today, and then the exam that I give you, I'm going to break it up into two parts. I think I told you it was multiple choice and short essay. So I think if we finish everything in terms of the last lecture guided notes today, I'll upload the multiple choice part of the exam for Thursday and get that graded. And then on the following Monday, I'll upload the second part of the exam, which would be the essay. And then I think I'm back either Wednesday or Thursday, and that's when we'll start Unit 2. Okay? So I already uploaded to the classroom the Lgn, and this will be the last lecture guided notes for Unit 1. This is still Chapter 4 on perspectives. We talked already a lot about the Freudian perspective. We talked about the biological perspective. And now we're going to wrap it up by looking at three perspectives that are not as emphasized as much on the exam. The behavioral perspective, which we talked about in 105 when we talked about behaviorism, and we talked about Ivan Pavlov and classical conditioning, and we talked about John Watson with classical conditioning, and then we talked about B.F. Skinner with operant conditioning, and then we talked about Albert Bandura with observational learning or social learning. So all of those play a role in not only the development of normal behavior, but they also play a role in the development of abnormal behavior. And again, it's based on the following assumptions. So the behavioral perspective, right? If you remember, one of the big sort of questions in psychology is this idea of nature versus nurture. How much of who we are is there because of our biology and genetics? So if you look at the biological perspective, they would sort of fall firmly on the side of nature, right? Freud would be somewhere in the middle. He believed that it was a blend of nature and nurture, the id being an instinctual component, and how we deal with those idinal instincts sort of shapes personality. But the behavioral perspective would fall completely in the nurture camp. And the behaviorists believe, again, primarily that all behavior develops as a function of what happens in your environment. So the main assumptions from the behavioral perspective in regards to abnormality are as follows. So we all interact with our environment, and those interactions teach us things. So the behavioral perspective believes that behavior can be maladaptive in a sense that we learn to make the responses the wrong way to certain environmental stimuli. And again, if you think about when we talk about abnormal behavior occurs as a function of behavior that is either dysfunctional, distressful, deviant, or in some cases, dangerous. So the behavioral perspective says that abnormality happens as a result of faulty learning through the environment. So from this perspective, abnormal behavior is acquired through the same processes in which normal behaviors are acquired. So for instance, when we talked about classical conditioning, remember in classical conditioning, we said there were the four elements: the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. So when we get into Unit 2, we're going to talk about different types of anxiety disorders, where the primary symptom is anxiety. And one of those types of anxiety disorders are phobias. So if you look at a phobia through sort of the lens of classical conditioning, let's say you have a person that develops a phobia of being in a car, right? Anytime they're in a car, anytime they have to get in a car, they start having anxiety, they start having panic attacks. So somebody that has a panic attack only in the presence of an automobile, that wouldn't necessarily be considered panic disorder. That would be considered a phobia because it only happens to them when they're around a car. So if you look at it from this perspective, right, the unconditioned stimulus. So let's say Jane is driving down the street one day and Jane has, not a horrible car accident, but, she gets banged up pretty good. She gets out of the hospital a couple weeks later, and the next time she goes to get in a car, she starts feeling overwhelming anxiety to the point where she can't drive anymore. And as a result of that, she feels distress. As a result of that, she can't, keep her job. That's dysfunction. As a result of that, she is now suffering. So again, if you look at it through this lens of classical conditioning, She developed the anxiety because she connected it, she associated it with the accident. But now that association has generalized. Remember, we talked about stimulus discrimination and stimulus generalization. Now that anxiety has generalized not just to the accident, but to being in or around a car. So, from a classical conditioning perspective, right, the unconditioned stimulus was the accident. The unconditioned response to the accident was fear and anxiety. The car now becomes the conditioned stimulus, and her fear and anxiety around a car now becomes the conditioned response. So, therapeutically, if she is coming to seek help, the goal, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, the goal is to help break that conditioned stimulus conditioned response bond. And that's a process that we'll talk about called counter conditioning. And you're going to see that in the next slide. That's one of the therapeutic techniques that we use in behavioral therapy. Then, if you think about operant conditioning, so in classical conditioning, we talked about learning by association. Operant conditioning is learning by reinforcement or consequence. So, in operant conditioning, let's talk about, I don't know, something like alcoholism. If you look at alcoholism from a Freudian perspective, a Freudian therapist might say that that person is an alcoholic because of some kind of trauma that occurred early on in their childhood during the oral stage. And now they're using the bottle as a way to sort of manipulate the mouth, drinking, sort of using the mouth as a way to deal with anxiety. So a Freudian would say that they have a classical oral fixation. They're using their mouth as a way to deal with anxiety because when they were younger, either during bottle feeding or breastfeeding, that was the only way that they can feel comfortable, by using their mouth, by taking food in. But now, as an adult, even though they're not aware of it, they're doing the same thing, but now they're doing it with a bottle of alcohol as opposed to a bottle of milk. Okay? So from operant conditioning, from the behavioral perspective, that's a bunch of hogwash. That whole Freudian stuff doesn't make any sense whatsoever. All right? The person is stressed out. The person drinks. The stress goes away. The person feels better. So in a sense, when the person is stressed out, the behavior of drinking negatively reinforces itself, because when the person drinks, the stress goes away. Next time they feel stressed, they drink again. Okay? Or in terms of positive reinforcement, the person feels that when they drink, they're more self-confident, they feel more sure of themselves. So from operant conditioning, from this perspective, you have to look at what happens after the person drinks. Are they drinking because it's giving them something they want, like self-confidence, positive reinforcement, or are they drinking because it's taking away something they don't want, which is the anxiety, negative reinforcement. But again, the key is the person has learned through interacting with their environment that alcohol does something to them which makes them feel good or takes away a feeling that's bad. Has nothing to do with an oral fixation. It has to do with reinforcement, reward, consequence. Okay? Then you have social learning, which we talked about with Albert Bandura, meaning that we look to other people as a way to see how we should behave. So if you have a child who's raised in a family and that family fights a lot and there's a lot of dysfunction in that family, that child has learned by watching their parents and their brothers and sisters that this type of behavior is satisfactory, that this is acceptable behavior, yelling and screaming at each other. Okay? So in a sense, they've learned to be dysfunctional in their relationships by watching dysfunction in their relationship at home. Okay? So from the behavioral perspective, mental illness can be understood by some kind of maladaptive interaction with the environment. And that maladaptive interaction has its roots in either learned association, classical conditioning, learned consequences, operant conditioning, or social learning, learning by watching what's happening in your environment. Now, treatment from this perspective. So if you think about this perspective in terms of treatments, one of the most important things that you want to do is try to change the way the person is conditioned. So for instance, let's talk about that example I gave you earlier where the person has a fear of being in a car. So now they come to you, you're a behavioral therapist, and they want to know what can you do for them to help them feel more comfortable in a car. So as a behavioral therapist, the goal is to break that relationship between the conditioned stimulus, the car, and the conditioned response, the fear. So what you want to do is change that conditioned response. And that process of changing the conditioned response from something maladaptive, bad, to something better is called counter conditioning. And one of the techniques that we use as a form of treatment is called systematic desensitization. And what basically systematic desensitization is a process in which you're working with the client to help them become more and more relaxed in a situation that would normally produce anxiety. That's what we mean by desensitizing them. So at some point, hopefully, that person doesn't feel anxiety anymore when they're in a car. They feel more relaxed so they could drive and get to work and do everything they need to do without having to worry about that overwhelming fear and anxiety by being around a car or being in a car. So what you do in a situation using systematic desensitization is the first thing you do is create what's called an anxiety hierarchy. So you basically set up a series of steps. Step one might be being around a car. Step two might be, getting inside a car, but the car is not driving. Step three might be getting inside the car, driving the car, but the person who has the anxiety is not driving. They're in a car with someone else who's driving. Step four might be that person who has anxiety now has to drive the car, but there's someone in the car with them. And then at the top of that anxiety hierarchy, the person has to drive the car by themselves. So the key here is you use some type of biofeedback mechanism, meaning you teach the person how to relax. It could be through focused meditation. It could be through deep breathing exercises. And once they understand how to relax themselves, then you introduce those steps. So the first step is you sort of work with them around a car, and you keep doing that over and over again until they are able to approach a car and not feel any anxiety. Then once they could get into the car, once they could be around a car without feeling any anxiety, then they sit in the car. And they have to sit in the car and teach themselves how to relax. And they do that over and over again until they could be in the car without any anxiety. And then the third step is they have to be in the car with someone else driving. And again, they have to learn how to relax while someone else is driving. And then the fourth step is they have to be in a car and they have to drive it with someone else in it. But hopefully by the time you get to the top of that hierarchy where they're sort of driving by themselves, they feel in control and they feel that they can sort of deal with the anxiety and they can lower the anxiety level enough so that they'll be capable of driving that car. And this is probably one of the most effective treatments for phobias, systematic desensitization. Okay. Then we go to the cognitive perspective. And if you remember what cognitive perspective or what cognition means, it means thinking or thoughts. So the cognitive perspective is based on the assumption that all abnormal behavior has its origins in abnormal thinking. So people that are depressed, remember we talked about this in class, they tend to see the world, the glass is half empty. They tend to see the negative all the time. That's just a perspective. That's just a way of thinking. From this perspective, the goal is to help the person identify their maladaptive or irrational thinking, and then hopefully over time help them change it. So this type of therapy focuses primarily on the thought process. The client is basically in a therapeutic relationship where the client is talking about the way they feel about themselves and the way they feel about the world. And it's the job of the therapist from this perspective to try to point out to them why their thinking might be irrational, why it might not make sense, and to interpret the events of their lives a little bit differently. So in a sense, what the therapist is trying to do here is help the person who tends to view the world or the glass as half empty, who tend now to help them view the world a little bit differently as maybe the glass being half full. So you want them to understand that some of the ways that they think tend to be maladaptive and irrational, and it's that maladaptive way of thinking, that irrational way of thinking, that can eventually lead to depression and can eventually lead to anxiety. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the more common irrational thoughts that people have that could predispose them to developing depression, that can predispose them to developing anxiety. So Top 5 irrational beliefs that you tend to see sort of being played out a lot in cognitive therapy is the first one has to do with approval. People believe that they need to be approved of by all people all the time. Okay. And that's not true. You don't need to be approved by anyone. You just need to approve, by primarily yourself. You're the person that's in charge of your life. You have to, at the end of the day, you have to give approval to yourself. If you're looking to other people for approval all the time, that's going to be a problem. Okay. Then another irrational belief, you see this a lot in people that have perfectionist kinds of personalities, is everything they have to do well. Okay. There's no point of trying anything if I can't do well. And that's not, again, necessarily true. Sometimes just trying something is enough. Just getting enjoyment out of the journey, not the destination, sometimes is enough. You don't have to be good at everything you do. You don't have to be, an A student in every class, but you need to be happy with your attempt. You need to be happy with you're trying to do something just to learn, just to better yourself. Okay? Then you have another one, which is very common. People should like me. That's not true. So you have a lot of friends and you only focus on a few people that, for whatever reason, say bad things about you or talk behind your back or that kind of thing. That's an irrational belief that all people should like me. Okay. The only people that should like you are the people that you like. And in turn, hopefully, they're friends, right? Doesn't mean something if that person at some point doesn't like you anymore. You should focus on what it is about the people that you like and how they feel about you. You shouldn't try to have everybody like you, because that's sort of going to lead to failure, right? I have a lot of friends, but I'm sure I've met people that, for whatever reason, I don't know why, didn't like me, and I'm okay with that. I don't need to have everybody that I meet like me, okay? Then another irrational belief is when bad things happen, I must obsess about it. So this is the idea that you have all of these good things happening in your life, that when one thing happens that's horrible, that's what you focus all your energy on. That's what you focus all of your efforts on. You have all of these friends, you're doing well in school,